hates when games let me fail. Not just die, fail. There is a difference. Dying is easy. Games let you die all the time. You fall off a ledge, get hit by a bus, encounter a slime, you reload, sigh dramatically, maybe blame the controller, even though it was absolutely your fault. But old Sierra games let you fail slowly, quietly, hours before you even knew you had failed. You could be wandering through a beautiful fantasy kingdom, feeling clever, feeling prepared, collecting random nonsense from strangers and forests and suspicious little cottages, and somewhere, buried 3 chapters behind you, was the one thing you forgot. The pie, the bridle, the fish hook, the mushroom, that random spell ingredient, the single conversation you skipped because you were 12 years old and impatient and thought, surely this game wouldn't let me walk confidently into my own doom. But Sierra would. Oh, Sierra definitely would. King's Quest V is infamous for this. You can miss items early on that become essential much later. You can make a bad decision that doesn't punish you right away. The game doesn't stop, flash a warning, or gently place a glowing exclamation point over the thing that you need. It just lets you keep going, lets you believe you're fine. It lulls you into a false sense of security. And then, hours later, when you're deep enough into the story to feel emotionally and logistically committed, the game finally turns around and says, "Oh, you mean you don't have that?" And that was it. You weren't stuck because you didn't understand the mechanics. You were stuck because you didn't respect the world. They expected you to look, to listen, to remember, to take notes, to treat the world like it mattered. In King's Quest, a fairy tale object is rarely just decoration. In Quest for Glory, your stats, class, timing, and choices shape how you survive. In Space Quest, the joke is often that the universe just doesn't care whether Roger Wilco lives or dies. And somehow, that cruelty made these worlds feel more real. Because real places don't pause to explain themselves. Real places have histories you can misunderstand. Real places have rules you learn through consequence. And as an archaeologist, I spent a lot of time thinking about that. Context matters. A broken bottle isn't just a broken bottle. A stone tool is not just a stone tool. A room, a road, a grave, a ruin, none of it means much without where it was found, what surrounded it, and what someone failed to notice the first time around. The Sierra games trained that same strange little muscle in me early. Pay attention. The object matters. The room matters. The weird throwaway line matters. The thing you ignored might be the thing that saves you, or locks you out forever. So today, I want to talk about why old games were so mean, why Sierra, especially, seemed so comfortable letting players die, fail, restart, and occasionally stare into the middle distance, realizing they had ruined their own save file 3 hours ago. And why, as frustrating as that was, I think it made those games better. You see, here's what I've realized. Sierra didn't hate you. Sierra trusted you. If you didn't grow up with Sierra Online, it's hard to explain just how personal failure used to feel. Yes, it was frustrating, annoying, but above all, it was yours. You could spend hours in King's Quest V thinking you were doing great. You've crossed the desert, you've dodged a witch, you've solved riddle after riddle, made it to the snowy hills of Serenia. You're feeling smart, maybe even starting to feel a little smug. And then you hit a wall. Not because the puzzle was impossible, not because the controls were bad or because the game was bugged, but because a few hours ago, you forgot the pie. Or maybe you didn't learn your lesson from King's Quest I and you ate the pie. If you know, you know, and if you don't, early in King's Quest V, Graham can get a custard pie from a baker. It seems like one of those ridiculous fairy tale inventory gags, exactly the kind of thing you pick up, laugh at, and assume will maybe become relevant later, in a way that makes absolutely no sense. And to be fair, you'd be right, because much later, that pie becomes essential for escaping a Yeti. And if you don't have it, that's it. No warning, no, this choice may affect the ending, no helpful companion piping up with, "Graham, I have a sudden and highly specific feeling about baked goods." No glowing icon. The game just quietly reveals you've been doomed for hours. And weirdly, I don't think that was entirely bad design. Because Sierra wasn't trying to build safe little sandboxes. It was trying to build worlds. And worlds, by definition, don't revolve around you. When Roberta Williams designed the first King's Quest in 1984, thinking in terms of player retention metrics, onboarding funnels, or how quickly a game could get you to feel clever before asking you to subscribe to something. She was thinking like the storyteller she is. Like someone obsessed with fairy tales, mythology, mystery novels, and old adventure stories. King's Quest changed the industry for a reason. It wasn't just one of the first graphical adventures. It was the first one to create a world where your character could move behind trees, around buildings, and through space in a way that felt almost theatrical, like stepping inside a storybook. IBM originally partnered with Sierra to showcase the graphical power of the IBM PC Junior, and King's Quest became the game that helped define Sierra's identity. But here's the part I think a lot of retrospectives glide past. Roberta's worlds weren't just beautiful, they were indifferent. And that indifference is key. In King's Quest, you can drown, fall off cliffs, get eaten by wolves, touch the wrong thing, type the wrong command, miss a single object, or ignore the suspicious-looking room. And the game won't step in front of you like a concerned crossing guard. Because Sierra assumed a lot of things games often don't. That paying attention is part of play. And, as a kid, that felt cruel. I remember sitting in front of the computer, clutching a notebook, because if I didn't write things down, I'd forget something. A clue, a riddle, a spell ingredient, a weird line from some troll under a bridge. And Sierra wasn't exactly hiding the ball here. The manuals themselves tell you what kind of game you're in. The King's Quest III manual warns that disaster may strike in the most unlikely places, tells you to save often, and says if you're stuck, you may have forgotten something vital. Then, in the very next breath, it offers to sell you a hint book, which isn't necessarily villainy, but it is, at minimum, extremely on brand. And if I forgot something, that wasn't the game's problem. That was mine. Looking back, I think maybe that's why these games stayed with me. It's not because Sierra rewarded success. It made failure memorable. And that's authorship. That's a designer saying, this world exists whether you're ready for it or not. And once you understand that, Sierra stops looking merely mean. It starts looking like a game asking one very simple question. Are you paying attention? And if you're not, well, there's a Yeti waiting for you. Death by curiosity, or why Roberta Williams kept killing us. Once you understand that Sierra trusted players, you start noticing something else. Sierra also seemed alarmingly comfortable killing them. A lot. In various ways. And not in just the oops, I missed the jump sense. I mean theatrical deaths, funny deaths, embarrassing deaths. Deaths that feel like the game itself has raised an eyebrow and said, well, that was certainly a choice. Graham falls off a cliff, Rosella gets dragged into the ocean, Roger Wilco disintegrates, a bridge collapses, a snake bites you, a wolf eats you, a witch wins, a troll gets the last laugh. And then, almost worse than dying, the narrator shows up. Calm, polite, amused, to explain exactly how you've gotten yourself killed. And if you grew up with Sierra, you know that voice. It wasn't angry, it wasn't especially cruel. If anything, it sounded disappointed, which frankly may have been worse. A lot of people look back at Sierra games and say, those games were wildly unfair. And sometimes, yes, they absolutely were. I'm not here trying to defend every well-tongued puzzle, every parser tantrum, or every moment where you typed look tree instead of look at tree, and the computer decided that you were simply too stupid to continue living. Some Sierra logic was experimental. But I also think people sometimes miss what those deaths were doing. Because in a Roberta Williams game, death usually wasn't random, it was narrative, informational, world building. Take King's Quest IV, The Perils of Rosella. And if we're talking about Sierra history, we have to talk about Rosella. Released in 1988, King's Quest IV was not the typical sequel. It was a technical leap for Sierra's SCI engine, with orchestral-style music, day-to-night transitions, a real in-game clock, and, more importantly, one of the earliest female protagonists in a commercial adventure game. Rosella wasn't waiting to be rescued. She was doing the rescuing. She leaves Daventry to save her dying father, King Graham, while also trying to save the fairy Genesta. And Roberta didn't soften the world just because the protagonist changed. If anything, Tamir feels even more dangerous. Rosella gets chased, captured, poisoned, drowned, eaten, lost, locked out. And if you don't manage your time well, or miss a critical task, you can reach one of multiple endings, including one where Rosella makes it home, only to watch her father die. That's brutal, and kind of brilliant. Because that's not just slapping on a game over screen. That's consequence. That's tragedy. That's a fairy tale remembering its roots. That old fairy tales were warnings before they became merchandise. And that part matters. Because Roberta Williams has talked for years about how fairy tales, mythology, and classic storybooks shaped King's Quest. The creatures, puzzles, and story beats draw from folklore, fairy books, grim stories, and other literary traditions. And that made something click for me later as an adult. Sierra wasn't killing us because it hated us. Sierra was killing us because fairy tales don't protect you. They were never meant to. Little Red Riding Hood doesn't get a quest marker, Hansel and Gretel don't get autosaves, and if you walk into the woods assuming the world exists for your convenience, well, that usually ends badly. So Death in Sierra wasn't mechanical failure. It was curiosity tested. Touch the wrong artifact, talk to the wrong stranger, trust the wrong creature, skip the wrong room, ignore the wrong clue, and suddenly the world reminds you you're not the center of the story. That's what made Death useful. Not because it was pleasant, despite all the puns it almost never was, but it taught you the terms of the world you'd entered, its dangers, its moods, its senses of humor, its willingness to let you become a cautionary tale under 3 clicks. By the mid-90s, Sierra didn't even need to kill you every time anymore. It had already taught you how to be afraid. The cruel genius of getting locked out. If Death was Sierra's warning shot, getting locked out was the real betrayal. And I do want to separate those two things because they're not the same design move. A death can be funny, a death can be instructive, a death can make a world feel more dangerous and more alive. An unwinnable state is something else. Death tells you when you've failed. A dead-end save file lets you keep playing after the game has already quietly closed the door behind you. Death, at least, has the decency to announce itself. A dead end is quieter, meaner. It lets you keep walking around the corpse of your own playthrough. And there's a specific kind of pain that only old adventure gamers seem to understand. The anxiety around needing to save often. You're so deep into the game, like really deep. You've crossed kingdoms, solved riddles, talked to everyone twice, collected what feels like the entire forest. And then nothing works. You try every inventory item, every dialogue option, every screen, every weird verb combination your sleep-deprived little brain can invent. And eventually, it hits you. Not like a jump scare, more like a slow, creeping horror. You're not stuck because you missed the solution. You're stuck because you missed the opportunity. And that's a completely different kind of punishment. These are what players later started calling unwinnable states. Situations where the game continues to function normally, but because you missed a critical object, skipped a trigger, or made the wrong choice earlier, the ending, the good ending, is no longer possible. And Sierra became famous for them. Notorious, really. The most infamous example is probably King's Quest V, which I brought up earlier. And if you've played King's Quest V, I already know some of you are yelling at your screens. The pie. That damned pie. The problem wasn't the Yeti. The problem was the version of you who walked past the bakery 3 hours ago and thought, nah, I'm good. And honestly, that's pretty evil. But the pie isn't really about the pie. It's about the attention. It's about whether you treated the world like a world or like a checklist. Because Sierra didn't want you speedrunning content. Sierra wanted you wandering, examining, talking, collecting, being curious, being weird, being the kind of player who clicks on the random baker not because the game told you to, but purely because he exists. And Quest for Glory 4 does something even more uncomfortable. Because its unwinnable states aren't really about objects at all. They're about whether you were paying attention to the right things at the right time. Literally. There's a domovoi, a little household spirit, the kind of creature that exists in Slavic folklore, specifically to watch over people who deserve to be watched over. And he appears in the inn's common room at midnight. This isn't a combat encounter or a puzzle or a little sparkling item on the ground. Just a sad creature sitting in a dark room, waiting to see if you're the kind of person who shows up. If you miss him, you don't get the information you need to save Tanya. And if you don't save Tanya, you don't finish the game. There's no warning, no second chance, no concerned pop-up informing you that a supernatural being attempted to make contact and you were apparently asleep. The world just moves on without you. And I really, really love that about these types of games, because the game's not asking you whether you can fight or solve puzzles. It's asking whether you are curious enough about a haunted village to wander its inn at midnight on the off chance that something worth noticing might be there. In Quest for Glory, missing conversations, training opportunities, class-specific interactions, or timed events can permanently alter quests, stats, or endings. In Space Quest, Roger Wilco is basically one poor decision away from becoming a cosmic punchline at all times. And in many Sierra games, the wrong choice didn't just affect your progress, it changed how you remembered the entire game. Back in the day, you didn't have a browser open with a wiki. You didn't have YouTube walkthroughs. You had a notebook. Maybe a hint book if you were lucky. Maybe a friend at school who heard from her brother that you could save both Princess Casima's parents, but didn't know how. And then, when you get locked out, you didn't just reload. You interrogated yourself. What did I miss? Who did I not talk to? What did that random line mean? Why did I ignore that object? This is why these games stayed with me. Because Sierra didn't just make me solve puzzles, they made me reconstruct entire events. They make you work backwards from the evidence. And it makes you ask, what happened here? Not what I wish had happened here. And even when Sierra started getting gentler about this, the old instinct never completely disappeared. Take Gabriel Knight, Sins of the Fathers, which in many ways is a much kinder game than the older King's Quests. Jane Jensen structures it in days, and the game usually won't let you end a day until you have done exactly what you need. But then, right at the end, the original game still remembers its roots. On day 10, when Gabriel infiltrates Honfor, you need the right items for the specific escape plan. But if you find grace before gathering what you need, you can push the story forward and strand yourself with no way of finishing it. Which might be an unintentional unwinnable state, but still unwinnable. Not a missing pie, not a fishhook you failed to pocket in the forest. A full-blown occult murder cult is collapsing around you. Your friend is in mortal danger, and the thing that ruins you, essentially, is a failed wardrobe check. Now, the 20th anniversary remake quietly fixes that. One member of the remake team later said that they altered day 10 so that players couldn't get stuck forever. The original let you live with your choices. And I do think that that's kind of the strange genius of the unwinnable state, intentional or not. It's not just that you failed, it's that the game trusted you enough to let your earlier self become the villain. Women built my fantasy worlds. I've thought a lot about why Sierra's worlds stick with me. And yeah, part of it was the deaths. Part of it was the puzzle design. Part of it was the psychological damage of realizing I'd been in an unwinnable state for the last 3 hours because of some random object. But the older I get, the more I think a huge part of it was the women. Because some of the fantasy worlds that shaped me the most, the worlds that felt dangerous, funny, strange, beautiful, and occasionally downright unfair, were built by women. And I don't think that's an accident. Because women, historically, have always had a different relationship with danger, with being watched, with being underestimated, with entering unfamiliar spaces and immediately having to read a room. What exits are available? Who feels safe? Who doesn't? What's being said? What's not being said? Do I trust the drink I just got handed? And maybe that's part of why so many Sierra games, especially ones designed by women like Roberta Williams, Lori Ann Cole, and Jane Jensen, never felt dangerous in the same way a lot of male fantasy games from the 80s and 90s did. The danger wasn't in its big scary monsters, or its combat, or its power fantasy. It was in its observation, timing, social intuition, knowing when to trust someone, knowing when something feels off. And if you look at Rosella in King's Quest IV, that becomes really obvious. Because Rosella's not stronger than her world. She's not louder than it. She's not conquering it. She's just navigating it. And that feels a lot closer to how women actually move through the world. Carefully, curiously, sometimes bravely, sometimes cautiously, often both at once. And maybe that's why these games hit a little different now. Because as a kid, I just liked solving riddles. But looking back, I think women like Roberta Williams were really teaching me something else. How to survive a world that doesn't automatically make space for you. Not every wrong choice kills you. When people think about Sierra difficulty, they think about death. Falling off cliffs, getting eaten by wolves, being blown up in space, poisoned by witches, turned into some kind of magical cautionary tale because you clicked the wrong glowing object. And sure, Sierra loved killing its players. That part is well documented. But the older I get, the more I think the most interesting failures in Sierra weren't physical. They were social. Because some of the worst mistakes you can make in a game didn't kill you. They just changed how the world responded to you. And that's much closer to real life. Take Quest for Glory, Shadows of Darkness. Still one of my favorite games of all time. And one of Sierra's smartest. On paper, it looks like a fantasy adventure. Monsters, magic, combat, haunted forests, sexy vampires, classic stuff. But spend enough time in Mordavia and you realize something. The hardest part of surviving there isn't the fighting. It's in the reading people. Who do you trust? Who's lying? Who's hiding grief? Who's manipulating you? Who's genuinely trying to help? Who's dangerous because they're evil? And who's dangerous because they're broken? And that's not a typical gameplay mechanic. That's social navigation. That's anthropology. That's reading culture, reading body language, reading ritual, reading silence. And Sierra expected players, even young players, to do just that. No morality meter, no this character disliked this, no blue paragon icon, no red renegade icon, no pop-up telling you that your relationship has just changed. Just people talking, deflecting, testing you, watching you, and if you weren't paying attention, you might still finish the game, but you'd missed half the story. And that's what makes these games feel so human. Because, in real life, not every bad decision gets you killed. Sometimes it just closes a door, a friendship, a conversation, a chance, a story you never get to hear. And once again, Sierra trusted players enough to live with that. And then there's King's Quest VI, which is a fan favorite for good reason. What makes it brilliant isn't just in the puzzles, it's in the relationships. Alexander doesn't brute force his way through the Land of the Green Isles. He listens, he negotiates, he studies cultures, he solves problems differently depending on who he's dealing with. And if you miss something, an object, a clue, a social cue, you don't just miss a puzzle solution, sometimes you miss a better ending. And if you grew up on Sierra, that kind of pain hits different. Because sometimes the game doesn't say, you failed. Sometimes it says, you succeeded, just not completely. And that kind of hurts even more. Sierra, for all its chaos, all its parser nonsense, all its occasional pastry-based cruelty, understood something that a lot of games still struggle with. Failure doesn't always look like death. Sometimes it looks like a story that you almost understood. And if Sierra taught us how to fail and how to listen, then maybe the real question is, why don't more games trust players like that anymore? Why modern games are afraid to let us fail. Now, I want to be clear. This is not a modern games suck argument. That's lazy and stupid and just not true. Some of my favorite games are modern games. Hell, I've put hundreds of hours into Baldur's Gate 3, and that game absolutely trusts its players in a lot of ways that modern games don't. So no, this isn't just the nostalgia talking. This is design philosophy. Why did so many games stop letting players fail like Sierra did? The answer is complicated. If Sierra taught me anything, it's that failure creates memory, not convenience, not polish, not quality of life features, memory. Because I don't remember every successful puzzle I solved in King's Quest. I remember the mistakes. I remember the save file I ruined. I remember realizing hours too late that I'd missed something. I remember physically flipping through a notebook, trying to reconstruct where it all went wrong like some tiny, furious detective with a bowl cut. And if you're around my age or older, or if you grew up on old adventure games, you probably remember that version of yourself too. So what changed? Why don't more games do that anymore? Why don't games let you quietly ruin yourself? Well, part of it's technology, and part of it's money, but a lot of it is psychology. Back in the 80s and early 90s, adventure games didn't really have established design rules. Sierra, LucasArts, Infocom, everyone was kind of inventing the language as they went. And Sierra's language was, curiosity has consequences. Meanwhile, LucasArts, especially with games like The Secret of Monkey Island, which, in full disclosure, I still haven't played, started leading in the other direction. Ron Gilbert famously argued that players shouldn't be punished for exploring, especially not with unwinnable states. His Why Adventure Games Suck design manifesto criticized dead ends and player punishment, arguing that many adventure games created frustration instead of discovery. And honestly, he wasn't wrong. A lot of Sierra games were frustrating, sometimes needlessly so, sometimes gloriously so, sometimes why did a cat hair, a rubber chicken, and a pulley solve this so? But the industry listened, and over time, the pendulum swung hard. Games got bigger, more expansive, more cinematic, more accessible. As budgets climbed, so did fear. Because if your game costs tens of millions of dollars, you really don't want players rage quitting because they forgot to pick up a pastry. You don't want someone putting your game down after 3 hours and leaving a review that just says, soft locked, refund. I get it. Modern games, and I'm mainly talking about adventure games here, are trying to solve a different problem. They're designed for wider audiences, accessibility, limited free time, player retention, discoverability, smoother onboarding. And all of those are legitimate goals. But every design choice costs something. And I think what sometimes gets lost is trust. Because modern games often assume if the player misses something, the game should fix it. If the player gets lost, the game should guide them. If a player struggles, the game should highlight the answer. And again, that's not automatically bad, but it does create a different relationship between player and world. A safer one, a smoother one, a less traumatizing one. Sierra didn't do that. Sierra assumed if you miss something, you'll figure it out, or you won't. And if you didn't, that wasn't a failure of user experience. That was part of the story. And I know that sounds almost cruel now, but I think that cruelty created something we don't talk about enough. Ownership. Because when I beat a Sierra game, I didn't feel guided. I felt like I'd survived. Like I had actually learned something about the world, its people, its rules, its weird little logic, its dangers, its humors, its traps, and most importantly, its indifference. That's why I don't actually miss hard games or being locked out of games or being stuck in a fail state. I miss games that trusted players enough to let the players live with being wrong. And I think this gets into why we remember what hurts us. The point is not that Sierra was objectively better. It wasn't. The point is not that games today are too soft. They're not. The point is that 30, sometimes 40 years in the future, Sierra players can still tell you exactly where they got stuck, exactly which save file broke their little kid heart, why somehow a pixelated pie is just as memorable as some AAA campaign you played. Sierra didn't really care if you finished the game. It cared if you noticed. And to me, that's a very different thing. For instance, in King's Quest VI, it's not Alexander saving the princess that I think back on. I think about the land of the Green Isles. I think about the Cliffs of Logic, the catacombs, what lies beyond Chessboard Land. The feeling that every island has its own history, its own logic, its own rules, topography, culture. I think about the way I clicked on everything. Every bookshelf, every tapestry, every brick, every random object that probably meant nothing, but in Sierra, it could mean everything. And I refuse to write off this feeling as just nostalgia. I think what it is immersion, authorship. Sierra created worlds that don't merely entertain you because you exist. The worlds exist whether you're ready for them or not. And I think it's why mean games really stuck, because they were about paying attention, scribbling notes, remembering conversations, reading people, learning how to live with consequence. I think that's why, for me, adventure games feel weirdly close to archaeology. I mean, other than the fact that it can be a lot like pixel hunting because you just find random little things in the forest or in the sand. But mostly it's because archaeology is not really about what you find. It's about where you find it, what it was used for, who it belongs to, the context, how it can be combined with something else to understand it better. It's about incomplete stories and what survives. what gets missed. Looking at a broken thing and asking, who was here? Who did they care for? What did everyone else overlook? And if I'm being honest, that's still how I like to play games. I like playing games like delineating a site, like a landscape, like treating the worlds like somewhere that doesn't have to reveal itself just because you showed up. You have to earn it, earn your way into these worlds, into these stories, these interactions. And maybe that's why so many of these early games haunt us. Not because they were perfect, God knows they weren't. Sierra games could be ridiculously cruel, opaque, sometimes hilarious, sometimes completely unfair, sometimes held together with fairy dust, parser logic, and what I can only assume was pure developer spite. And yet we remember them because they made us feel something. Frustration, wonder, fear, curiosity, embarrassment, pride, sometimes all in the same afternoon. So no, I don't miss dying in games or being locked out. Not really. I don't miss corrupted save files or having to go back to the very beginning because I used the wrong type of currency. And I definitely don't miss begging my brothers to call the hint hotline because some wizard turned me into lawn fertilizer. What I miss is that feeling of being trusted. I miss worlds that don't flatten themselves around me. I miss games that assumed I'm smarter than how I felt. I miss stories that let me fail because they believed I'd come back. And I did, every time. So no, I don't think old games are mean, not really. I think maybe they just loved us enough to tell us no.